So I'm going to start with a photo. And I don't know whether anyone has seen this photo or this artwork, or does anyone know where it is?
Cannon Hall?
Nearly, it's not a million miles from Cannon Hall. It is a South Yorkshire Hall.
Well, we are.
Yeah, it's nearly. So I didn't expect you really to know it because it is Cusworth Hall in Doncaster. So it's actually about a 10-minute walk from where I grew up. And it's only been here for about a month. And my sister actually sent me, which I didn't know about this artwork, and she sent me a picture of it as soon as it came up, saying, oh wow, you know, look at this. And I was really, really struck by the fact that this artwork had been commissioned by Doncaster Council to celebrate the 40th anniversary of the strike. So it seems to me to symbolise in popular memory the sort of victory of one version of the strike. The one where valiant miners, their wives right beside them, stand in solidarity together, fighting for a community against the Thatcherite ethos of individualism. And I was so struck that Doncaster Council clearly thought that this would be uncontroversial, this work, or at least within the town. Now, it's of course true that Doncaster was one of the places that remained most solid during the strike, so over 90% of miners within Doncaster stayed out for the whole year. Nevertheless, even in places like Doncaster, support for the strike was never total. Remaining out on strike could represent as much a fear of the social sanctions that came with breaking the strike as positive belief in the politics underpinning the NUM's actions. And you don't have to disagree with what the NUM was fighting for to recognise that there were many miners and their families who had unhappy stories to tell of the strike, who were broken by debt, who did not necessarily agree with all, or indeed any, of the NUM's aims. And I think it's really important for us to recognise that as historians, even when we, including myself, are incredibly sympathetic to the aims of the strike. So this picture therefore spoke to some of the questions that myself and Florence had when writing Women and the Miners' Strike. So how did this particular heroic narrative about the strike come to be constructed? How did it become so culturally dominant? And how did it shape the ways in which people have subsequently told their stories? So in our book, we were particularly interested in the ways in which those women who had been connected to the strike in various ways had remembered the dispute. And it'll be testimony from women from that research project that I'll be using today, rather than men. But I also think that what I have to say today has a broader resonance that really cuts across gender. So today I want to ask, how has the strike been remembered both publicly and privately? And how do public narratives shape private recollections? How has that changed in the 40 years since the dispute? And crucially, whose voices do we get to hear? So I'll tell you a little bit about the book. Keith's already told you quite a bit about it, but just a quick recap. We were given HRC money, thank you HRC. We interviewed just over 100 women alongside our postdoctoral research assistant. We interviewed a lot of activist women. They were the people who were often most comfortable putting themselves forward for the project, but we were also very interested in the experiences of non-activist women, and we also interviewed just a few women who had very ambivalent feelings against the strike or even hostile towards it. And the book really had several aims. We were thinking about everyday experiences of the strike. We wanted to understand those better. We really wanted to understand the mechanics of strike support better. So I imagine most people in this room are quite familiar with the idea of the women's support movement, but just in case anyone isn't, within the coalfields during the strike, there was an awful lot of women who sort of banded together in various pit villages, often under the banner of Women Against Pit Closures, and sort of often became involved in setting up soup kitchens for striking miners and their families, distributing food parcels, and also going on things like picket lines, marches, rallies and demonstrations. We were really interested in trying to understand how that organisation actually worked, because they did a huge amount of stuff, really. We wanted to use the strike as a lens to understand changes and continuity in working class women's lives in Britain over the sort of post-war period as well, so it had this sort of slightly larger brief, we felt, as research. We worked with archival and print sources as well as oral history, but we also were really keen to think about how the strike itself has been remembered, right? So that was the sort of another aim of the book, trying to think about how those public narratives of the strike have come to be. So I'd like to turn now to thinking about how the stories of women in the strike were written about during and immediately after the dispute. So immediately after the strike, many groups from the women's support movement created and published their own accounts of their activism in order to write the achievements of the movement into history. I'm sure that some of you in this room will be familiar with these sorts of books. In the media and in popular culture, women's experiences have only become more prominent over the years in representations of the strike. I think these representations have usually focused on activism and have constructed, again, a heroic narrative of miners' wives emancipated through their work in support groups. And we argue that this narrative really impacted on how many of our interviewees, particularly those who were involved in activism, remembered their own experience. I'll talk about this more towards the end of the lecture, but it was clear that some women used this narrative as a way of articulating what they felt to be the significance of the strike and the changes they had seen in their lives since. This narrative, however, was never totally hegemonic, and other women, both supporters and opponents of the strike, contested it, drawing on a range of alternative cultural discourses to give an account of their experience. So after the strike, as I've said, many groups in the women's support movement wrote their own stories, and these books became really important conduits through which narratives of the strike became politically embedded within leftist circles. There was an outpouring of books and pamphlets about women's activism based on women's written and oral accounts, and this really, I think, was an attempt to ensure that the mobilisation of women in the strike had a lasting legacy of education and politicisation, and to ensure that the achievements of the women's support movement weren't forgotten. So some, such as these edited volumes, The Cutting Edge, Here We Go, were driven by political activists from outside mining communities. So for example, The Cutting Edge was edited by Vicky Seddon, who was a lecturer at Sheffield Poly and also a writer for Marxism Today. But individual women's groups also produced their own accounts. It's sort of difficult to put a figure on the exact number, but we're talking at least several dozen of these sorts of books produced by individual groups, generally published by local presses that were really sort of part of that very radical local sort of community and worker rights and publishing movement that had its real moment in the 70s and 80s. And I know if you're in the charity shops in sort of former coalfield areas, these books are still quite often to be found. I know that my mother, one of the reasons I became interested in this project was my mother would constantly buy me these books when she found them in charity shops in Doncaster. So these books are a sort of different beast to these sorts of books. They're generally much shorter, they're produced collectively, and they're a real collage. If you've ever looked at them, you'll know they sort of include sort of biographies, poetry, drawing, photos. Lots of different women are given voice in them. And the books often sort of follow a formula where they intersperse positive biographies of group members with retellings of key events in the group's history. So you'll almost always get in these books a sort of story about the start of the strike, setting up a soup kitchen, the daily work of funding and feed raising, going on marches and rallies, standing on picket lines, of organising for Christmas, and of course the end of the strike. These books described not only the activism women had undertaken, but the impact of the strike. So here are examples of some of these books here. And you really get a sense through reading them about how women thought about their home life, their emotions, and their sense of self. So these books generally had a less overtly political framework than books like The Cutting Edge or Here We Go. Generally, I mean, there are some exceptions, but on the whole, though they gave space to a range of perspectives, collectively these books, I think, played a really important role in celebrating and cementing a particular sort of heroic narrative of the women's movement. Within these books, activists tended to be presented as ordinary women, and these sorts of tropes of being ordinary or being typical recur throughout these works. So, for example, in Women Living the Strike, Mavis Watson from Normanton, just up the road, recounted that, "Before the strike, I was a typical wife and mother. My husband worked shifts and I was there breakfast, dinner, tea. I'd clean the house, bake, sew, work the kids to and from school. I didn't think I had time for anything else." The strike in these books was often presented as a moment which occasioned deep personal change. An Ashington woman, whose memories were recorded in a collection of stories from Northumberland miners' wives, said, "At one time I wouldn't dream of doing or saying half the things that I do now. I've got the confidence now to go out and just do whatever I'm thinking of. I could never give a speech or anything like that, or even take over the chair, but now I have that confidence." And I would say these books often presented the women's support movement as a more or less spontaneous uprising of working class women. So North Yorkshire's Women Against Pit Closures, strike 84 to 85, you can really see that here. I'm not going to read out the full quote, but when we see here, sort of, she expected the women to sit back begging for our men to go to work. But we didn't. We stood up and shouted, "Don't dare threaten our miners' jobs, don't dare threaten our mining communities, and don't dare threaten our children's futures." You can also see this from another book, Commentary Miner Support Group, where Sally, don't have a surname, sort of remembered 40,000 women left their homes, families, roles as housewives to let their sisters know that they too were doing in their areas about this long and hard fight. So you can see in these accounts how Caulfield women were presented as standing up, as emerging into the public sphere, as becoming visible for the first time as political subjects. Though feminism was rarely explicitly mentioned, the strike in these books was generally configured as a moment of, if not women's collective emancipation, then at least personal liberation. Thus, activist women constructed a really powerful story of women's transformation, a story that, as we'll get later into the lecture, we might want to question somewhat. These books and pamphlets were an attempt to secure a place in history for the strike and the women's support groups, and to underline the importance of women to the strike. I think this concern to ascribe the historical significance of the women's support movement can be seen actually in the very title of a book like Mummy, What Did You Do in the Strike? You can see here how the title of this book is obviously a play on to really famous World War I poster, Daddy, What Did You Do in the War? And I think here you really see the way in which there's a powerful sense of the struggle and the heroic achievement of the women. Through the act of producing these works, I suggest that women were quite literally writing themselves into the historical record and making a claim for the significance of working class women as historical actors. And these accounts, I think, have been so important in how women's support groups have been remembered more broadly, not just in mining communities, but in sort of cultural productions. And I think they've been really key in shaping a sort of broader cultural, popular and also scholarly understanding of what the strike does. So I'll turn now to thinking about how the strike has been memorialised in popular culture. So, if these activist books were instrumental in constructing a narrative of women's triumph and transformation in the strike, then popular culture has ensured that that narrative has, in subsequent years, become culturally embedded, particularly on the left. Countless films, books, plays, documentaries, newspapers, magazine articles on the strike have been produced since the dispute's end. Again, I'm sure you're familiar with many of them. Most of those early plays and documentaries were made by sympathetic left-wingers who often worked in conjunction with striking communities and who reproduced, I'd say, many of these key heroic narratives about women and the strike, which were established actually very early on in the dispute. There's a sort of initial swathe of documentaries about the strike that produced during the strike itself, things like Ken Loach's Which Side Are You On?, the miners' strike campaign tapes, the Channel 4 documentary Please Don't Say We're Wonderful. And these are always overwhelmingly supportive of striking miners and actually do include quite a lot of coverage of the women's movement. So you can see some of these narratives really take shape very early on. Also sympathetic were plays such as David Thacker and Ron Rose's The Enemies Within, Peter Cox's The Garden of England, and Jane Thornton's Amid the Standing Corn, all written in the late 1980s from verbatim testimonies with mining communities. And I think this really sets up a sort of cultural feedback loop of how the strike is remembered. You know, people are going out, getting these testimonies, making into plays, and I think it has this sort of almost a rarifying effect in terms of which particular narratives sort of take a sort of cultural hold. Filmmakers and writers in the 1990s did turn away from the strike somewhat. It's really interesting, you don't see so much in the 90s. I went through scores of papers during this research for the 94-95 anniversary to see if I could find anything about the 10th anniversary of the strike, and there was nothing. Absolutely nothing in the Guardian, the Times, but also in like local papers like the Doncaster Free Press, the Barnsley Chronicle. But with the turn of the millennium, the release of Billy Elliot, I'm sure you know it, sort of heralds a real new wave of productions about the strike. I think something you might see most creatively actually in Jeremy Deller's famous artwork, The English Civil War Part 2, which is a recreation of the Battle of Orgreave using battlefield reenactors. It was shown on Channel 4. Women were rarely centre stage in some of these dramas and documentaries at the turn of the 21st century, but their role in the strike was certainly acknowledged. In 2004 saw 2 20th anniversary documentaries, Channel 4's Strike, When Britain Went to War, and BBC 2, The Miners' Strike. And I found the Channel 4 documentary, When Britain Went to War, particularly interesting. It features interviews with Women Against Pit Closure activists Anne Scargill, who you may be aware was Arthur Scargill's wife during the strike, although by this point of the filming of the documentary they had divorced, and her best friend Betty Cook, who was also a very prominent activist in Women Against Pit Closures, and we did interview both Anne and Betty for the project. And the voiceover of this Channel 4 documentary I found really fascinating because it sort of confidently informs the viewer that, this is a direct quote, before the strike, mining families lived a very traditional life. The men went to work whilst the wives stayed at home, which I think is sort of very simplistic and reinforces a very key narrative though about the strike and its effect on women, who were sort of apparently, in this version of mining communities, bound to the kitchen sink. Even though we know that by 1984, the participation of women from mining communities in the paid labour force was not really very different to those of women in other working class communities. There have, of course, over the last 10 years, I think, been, if anything, even more productions around the miners' strike. I'm sure you all know Pride from 2014. Women, of course, in this are really central because it's the women's support group who lesbians and gays support the miners in the Delice Valley sort of get together with. 2022 crime drama Sherwood, some of you may have seen it, takes a community divided by the strike in Nottinghamshire as its settings. And one of the storylines is this, is that an undercover spy cop infiltrates the local women's support group. And what I find interesting is the way in which women have become ever more prominent in this retelling of the strike. And again, as I'm sure you're all aware, this 40th anniversary year has seen a real swathe of documentaries to celebrate the strike, many of which I think do tap in to these key tropes around women's apparent transformation during the strike. And you see this in the media as well, or rather in the print press. So after relative quiet in the 90s, we see quite a lot of articles, both in the 2004 5th anniversary, the 2014 15th anniversary, and this 40th anniversary as well. So, on the 20th anniversary of the strike in 2004, there's an article on women's activism, and they interviewed Betty Cook. I find this article really interesting because of the way in which it presents Betty. Again, here we hear this sort of trope of women being transformed during the strike. Something happened that changed it completely, the 1984 miners' strike. It was during this year-long struggle that Cook found there was another world beyond the doorstep of her house in the village of Woolley, near the Yorkshire town of Barnsley. So this is the trajectory of a politically naive woman who was just a housewife being educated by the strike. But in fact, Betty wasn't just at home, she did have a job, and not only did she have a job, but she was actually the shop steward for Ustor at her local, in her local place of work. So it's not really true to say that Betty wasn't sort of politically active, but it is a convenient story in many ways for both the press, and in some ways it's quite a politically useful story for women against pit closures as well, because it's a dramatic story, right? This idea of the woman coming out to this sort of political education. And again, we see very similar accounts on the 30th anniversary of the strike. There's an interview with Brenda Proctor, who was a real movement shaker in Staffordshire Women Against Pit Closures there. And again, you see this really, really similar sort of narrative. Brenda Proctor was once a typical miner's wife, staying at home, bringing up the kids and making sure food was on the table when my man came back from work. And again, you see these narratives across the local press as well. Barnsley Chronicle, for example, by 2014, is carrying sort of the commemorations of the strike, and it has a sort of big piece which is literally found, women found their voices and grew in confidence. So these tropes of transformation, of confidence, again, you see them everywhere. So there's this slight shift, I think, in sort of newspaper and press coverage of the strike, which has shifted a little bit more to looking at women's roles in the strike. It's grown a little bit more positive, I think, and maybe even nostalgic for the strike over the sort of intervening decades. There's less focus, I think, on violent pickets in press coverage of the strike these days, more focus on the violence of the police, the hardships faced by families and communities, and the solidarity shown by striking miners and their wives. Of course, that's not in every single paper, it's not everywhere. We can still find those much more sort of hostile narratives to the strike. But I think on the whole, we have a much more positive view of the strike than certainly you would have seen in the mid-80s. And I think in some ways the closure of most of Britain's deep coal mines in the decade after the strike has undoubtedly reshaped ideas about the dispute. Obviously, Scargill remains a deeply controversial figure, but his claim that the government planned to destroy the mining community was, of course, essentially proved correct. And I think there's a sense in which that has helped to change perception of the miners' cause. It's interesting, even in the 92-93 rounds of pit closures, there was an awful lot more media sympathy for the plight of miners then than there was in 84-85, as it's really seeing that mining is actually a sort of dying industry. So I think women's experiences are part of the way in which the sort of story of the strike has changed subtly over the decades, and that there's more focus on them. Nevertheless, we argue in the book that the story that is told about women has actually changed remarkably little over the 40 years since the strike. As this article on women's activism in The Guardian suggests, that story has been one of ordinary miners' wives coming out from behind the kitchen sink, banding together to defend their communities and emancipating themselves in the process. Precisely the same narrative that journalists and activist groups constructed during and immediately after the strike. So there are many ways in which we might quibble with the factual accuracy of some of these ideas. As I've said, a lot of women in mining communities were involved in the paid labour force. Many in support groups, particularly those who sort of were leaders, who got the support groups off the ground, had been actually pretty politically active, particularly in the trade union movement before the 84-85 strike. Nevertheless, this narrative provided a really useful framework for which women who had been involved in support group activism to tell their stories. And it really structured, when we did our interviews for this project, you can see this narrative massively structuring the way in which some women, not all women, but the ways in which some women remembered and recounted their experiences. So I'm now going to turn to think about how these sorts of broader cultural narratives and framings around the strike really shaped the testimonies of the women that we spoke to. So as I've said, many activists we interviewed used the framework of transformation in telling the story of their strike experience. They suggested that their new experiences in the strike had changed them, had made them more self-confident, that's a term that's very often used, had given them a new voice, again a word often used, and had made them determined that they would not, as one put it in an interview to us shortly after the strike, go back to how it was. Activist women, I think in particular, had a strong emotional or psychological investment in this heroic narrative of the strike. To be able to place themselves in this narrative conferred legitimacy on their political activism, bolstered their self-worth, and in a more existential sense, I think, really gave meaning to their life stories. It was interesting, there were several people who we spoke to who'd been interviewed many, many times about their role in the strike. And they said explicitly to us, some of them, I love talking about it, I'm always happy to talk about it. And for me, that suggested something quite powerful about the place of the strike in their lives and how it really informed their sense of self in a very positive way for those women. And so many of our interviewees presented as like the strike's a moment of liberation. So one woman, for example, Alice Samuel, is a good example. She was born in 1958 in Lanarkshire and had moved to Fife with her minor husband and young children just a few weeks before the strike started. So she got involved in her local strike centre, actually partly to try and get to know people in her local community. She became incredibly involved in a lot of ways, involved in fundraising and feeding, became the Women Against Pit Closures representative for Fife. She participated in a sit-in in Seafield Colliery. And we asked how much of an impact the strike had on her life. She said she thought it had been huge. And she told us that many of her decisions after the strike had been possible because of the confidence she'd gained during the strike. She told us that she probably would not have left her ex-husband, but would have stayed with him as a good provider and, quote unquote, put with his craft if it hadn't been for the strike. She says, a lot of the choices and decisions that I've made since then are probably because of the confidence I gained in that time. So again, those key terms around confidence, very much there. Likewise, Anne Kirby, another woman we interviewed who was from Cowdenbeath, another dedicated strike activist, told us in her interview that the strike had given her confidence as well as new skills and played an important role in her decision to return to work once her youngest child was in school. Again, she said several times that she wouldn't have taken these opportunities had it not been for the strike. And she told us that the strike's impact on her was, quote, I found my voice, I found a platform, I became more politically aware, I found skills I never had or didn't think I had. So my interest here and our interest in the book is not really to say whether these narratives are true or false, but more to highlight the way in which their stories were profoundly structured by this wider sort of cultural understanding of women's roles in the strike, but also the way for which Alice and Anne, the strike was the prism through which they understood the rest of their lives. It is, of course, rarely possible to definitively attribute life trajectories to any one event. I'm sure the strike did play an important part for some women in changing their lives. But I think it's really also important to appreciate the significance of this heroic strike narrative, because this allowed or enabled women to think of the strike as a transformative event, enabling them to frame their life stories in a way which positioned the dispute as the driver of personal change for them. So it's really interesting, a lot of women who divorced their husbands after the strike often attributed that to the strike, even when it was quite a long time after the strike that they divorced. So Anne Kirby actually divorced her husband in the year 2000, but she said it was because of the strike. And I thought, well, that's quite interesting, because that's actually 16 years after the strike. So there's something interesting going on there with how women are forced to think, and, or not forced, but how these cultural frameworks provide a framework through which they tell their stories. Because of course, if the strike played a role in these women's changing lives, there are many other events in intervening years that did. During this period, we obviously have the industrialisation, massive rise of the service sector, which provides many more paid employment opportunities for women, the normalisation of married women's paid work, significant cultural shifts in gender norms, and these play such a huge role, obviously, in changing the lives of women in mining communities, as much as the strike did. And we would suggest, in fact we argue in the book, that really it's more accurate probably to see the women's support movement as a product of these broader shifts, rather than as a driver of them. Nevertheless, that shouldn't lead us to completely dismiss this idea of transformation through the strike. So the historian Penny Summerfield, who's a really wonderful historian of World War II and a brilliant oral historian, he's done a huge books on sort of women's work experiences during World War II. He has sort of famously argued that while the idea that women's work in the Second World War was liberating is something of a myth, that nevertheless it was a myth that came to retrospectively influence how many women told their stories. And I think reading that from Penny Summerfield was really a sort of bit of a light bulb moment for myself and Florence. Likewise, we suggest that for the women we interviewed, the myth of the strike itself became a facilitator for changes in women's perceptions of themselves. And that is no small thing. While some women describe the strike as an important moment propelling them into education, new careers, new political roles, many interviewees also told less dramatic stories, but also talked about subtle shifts in outlook. So, for example, Mary Price from Nottinghamshire, who was very active in Women Against Pit Closures there, recalled that before the strike she'd done everything for her husband Alan, who she had 6 children with, who 2 decades earlier had actually forced her to give up work after they had children. After the strike, however, she told us, I was no longer just a housewife. She said, if Alan asked for a cup of tea, I would say, the kettle's in there. And she said, I've never said that before. It's not a massive story, it's not a huge shift, but it nevertheless was significant for Mary. So she really used the strike as a sort of turning point in the story of herself. There was a shift here, I think, from a relational sense of self to a more autonomous and independent sense of self. There was a break here with an older culture which saw women as first and foremost helpmeets to men, their lives inscribed with a routine of care for others. This is not a dramatic break for Mary, and there were many women who told similar stories to Mary. She wasn't leaving her husband, just asking him to make his own cup of tea. But it was nevertheless a story, and it was clearly a story she'd told quite a lot, which had become invested with quite a lot of symbolic significance for her. However, as we move on towards the sort of end of the lecture, I also want to make the point that this sort of narrative of women's transformation in the strike was not completely dominant in our interview sample. I think it's quite important to retain the ability to believe that people have the sort of ability to push back against certain narratives that are, propagated for whatever reason. Even some strike activists, which I found interesting, were quite downbeat about how the strike broadly should be remembered. So Margaret Holmes, who was a WAPC activist from Kent, said, I wouldn't say it was a fantastic time, I would say it was the time we lived through. And Anne Kirby says she wouldn't have thought there was a lot to celebrate when asked about memorialising the strike. Others were more celebratory of the strike. but still contested some of the narratives about the changes it had occasioned. So Pat Smith from Dinnington in South Yorkshire did see the strike as an important turning point in her life in terms of the way in which it sort of shifted her sort of career paths and trajectories. She also went to university afterwards. But we asked her during her interview whether her husband did more around the house during the strike. Her husband Dave was actually the lodge president at Dinnington Hate. And I found this really interesting. Pat said, Dave always liked to tell the story himself that during the strike, it took women away from kitchen sink. And he always said, well, she was never behind it. And what's really interesting here is that both Pat and Dave are actually showing a real explicit awareness of this story about women coming from behind the kitchen sink. And they're both contesting it, saying, well, actually, that wasn't quite the case for us. You know, I had a life before the strike, my life became different, but I wasn't just this person behind the kitchen sink. I don't recognise that story. Janet Slater, who was an activist from Nottinghamshire, similarly complicated this straightforward narrative of liberation. She drew a comparison with women's work in the Second World War, but suggested that the strike was the occasion not of widespread transformation, but, she said, more like in the war, when women were called upon to do the jobs that only the men could do, but then after the war they had to go back to their roles. And I felt it was more like that. She said while she thought the strike did change some women, she concluded that, for me personally, it didn't have that effect. Some women that we spoke to also found the strike painful to recall. The majority of women we spoke to were quite happy to talk about the strike, and I think that's inevitable in the oral history project where you're asking for volunteers, right? But nevertheless, we did have some women put themselves forward, even though they clearly found it quite difficult. And I think it was particularly the case when their story about the strike sort of went a little bit against what were sort of these dominant narratives. So one woman whose story really went against these sort of prevailing cultural narratives about the strike was a woman called Carol, although she asked for us to give her a pseudonym, from South Wales. So Carol, in contrast to a lot of women that we spoke to, had never spoken about her strike story before in any sort of project or public forum. She was in her final year of school during the strike. Her father had been a striking miner, and he returned to work in the very solid South Wales coalfield 3 weeks before the end. And the violence that they felt was such that they had to have police protection. It's obviously an extremely difficult experience for a 15-year-old girl to go through. And the complexity of her own feelings about the strike was an evidence when she said a public discourse about the strike. It's either pro the strike or against the strike, and I say, do you know what? There's a whole bunch of people that are caught in this whole middle part as well. That's never talked about. And I think it's always, you know, really upset me that my father, even now, there's probably a few people that will look at my father in the head, they're going, scam. And Carol understood the aims of the strike. She wasn't hostile to the strike, but she felt it was incredibly unfair that her father, who had stayed out for nearly the entire time, had also become ostracised in his local community. Carol felt that both miners who had stayed out until the end and those who had returned to work were misunderstood. And she told us, really interestingly, that she felt she had to take part in this project as soon as she saw it advertised. She described the process of being interviewed as, and this is her words, an exorcism. Women whose husbands or fathers worked through the strike in coalfields like Nottinghamshire, I think also found their stories difficult to tell, partly because of shame and partly because there is not the sort of broader cultural frameworks through which those stories can be told. So 3 of the women that we had self-interviews for in Nottinghamshire cancelled their interviews. Eventually we did get them to speak to us, but I thought it was really telling that it was only in Nottinghamshire coalfield that we had those sorts of issues. And they appear to be reluctant to reminisce, I think probably because they've been cast, at least in some strike histories, as the villains rather than the heroes of the hour. And of course the fact that the pits did close in Nottinghamshire in the end, I think adds another layer of complexity as to how that dispute has been remembered there. because a lot of people, I think, came to feel that they had been lied to by the National Coal Board. So the strike was a real locus of very painful feelings. So one such woman was Polly, again, this is a pseudonym. Now Polly had been very active in her village in South Nottinghamshire and setting up a women's group to protect working miners, so she was pretty politically active. And I asked her in the interview, she said, would you have changed your mind if you known the pits had closed? And she said, well, you see, with hindsight, if we'd known that, that's why I'm so angry with Scarborough for not going about it the right way, giving us the chance to vote for a strike, because then we'd have all been in it together. Now, given Polly's political engagement, I can't believe that she didn't know at the time it wasn't framed as a strike to save jobs. She conflated two separate issues here, the reasons for which the strike was being fought. She talked in a longer interview about the sort of thing about the strike being around wages, which obviously it wasn't, and the deeply controversial question of whether a national ballot should have been held. But what I think is also important to say, that in the moment of the interview, so as I say, I did this interview, I don't think Polly was being deliberately disingenuous. I think for her, this had become her truth in a way. It was, I think, simply too painful for her to acknowledge that striking miners, who she had opposed so vigorously, were correct in their fears for the future of pits. So for those women whose feelings towards the dispute were ambivalent or hostile, I think really the oral history process was a very difficult exploration of their own memories and feelings, which just couldn't be reconciled within this sort of dominant cultural paradigm that valorised the strike. Nevertheless, I think it's significant that these women did want their stories to be heard. Through speaking to us, they hoped that their stories would become part of the historical record. So Carol from South Wales said she wanted to have the peoples whose stories were never talked about put onto the record. Another woman, Chloe, not a real name again, from Barnsley, actually had a different view of the strike. Her husband remained on strike and she was broadly supportive, but she hadn't got involved in activism. And she said that, quote, she felt discussions about the strike were always about the miners that were in the strike or mine communities, or about dramatic forms of activism. And she went, but not everybody had the chance to be that. People's lives don't always give you a chance to fight for others. Sometimes you're too busy fighting for yourself and to get by. So it's for them, for those females, that I'd like to be heard. Because there's a lot of them, and the strike was a lot about how we just kept going. We're always written out. So the prominence of activism in accounts of women and the strike is understandable. The support movement was obviously dramatic and dynamic, but it has rendered other stories sometimes difficult to articulate. So it's crucial, myself and Florence have argued, to pay attention to voices of non-activists, the majority among coalfield women. Only about 5% of women in coalfields did become involved in activism, it's important to remember. We have to hear this wider range of voices if we're to understand the strike and the various shifts in women's lives, as they sometimes claim to have occasion. Restoring these voices to the record helps us to better understand all of those things. So to move to a conclusion, it's easy to be despairing about the aftermath of the strike. The NUM was broken, and trade unions, despite the best efforts of the RMT, have never again wielded so much power in Britain. There's no doubt that pit closures were economically devastating for mining districts. Most of the women we interviewed felt these losses very heavily, and indeed a number of women contested sort of more heroic versions or memories of the strike, precisely because they felt it had achieved nothing and had occasioned huge hardship for no apparent end. Yet for some women, particularly those who'd been committed activists, the strike was still the standout experience of their lives. The drama of the dispute and the extensive media coverage it received gave them, probably for the first time, a sense that they were participating in something of global significance, that their actions impacted on the lives of people, and that they too could make history. Clearly, such women's testimonies, I think, are not transparent windows onto the experiences they had in the strike, but constructed through this very culturally embedded heroic narrative of the strike that we've talked about today, that's so prevalent across films, documentaries, the media. These public vehicles that keep retelling the strike story have profoundly shaped how women tell their stories. Keeps on reifying this very certain narrative of the strike. And it's beginning to increasingly, I think, determine whose stories we hear. Nevertheless, I think it's appropriate to acknowledge the political power of this narrative and how many women we interviewed were keen for their positive aspects of their strike experience to be remembered as a source of education. Because clearly it is a source, can be used as a source of political education and of inspiration for future generations. So Janet Slater told us when we asked what would you like people to take away from the strike in 50 years' time, she said, stand up for what you believe in and don't let the bastards grind you down. Caroline Poland, who was a Women Against Pit Closures activist from Sheffield, said that she'd like people to remember the spirit of solidarity, the building up of different understandings of different lives, the building up of respect for people from different lives. And Christina Bell, who was a Geordie but who lived in Nottinghamshire during the strike, said she wanted people in the future to know that we stood up to the establishment. All right, we might not have won it, but we stood up for what we believed in, we stood up for what we thought was right, and it's worth remembering that people can still do this. As Christina's words suggest, supporting the strike gave women a sense of agency in extremely challenging circumstances very much not of their own making. This couldn't entirely compensate for the failure of the strike, but it's clear that activism had its own rewards and allowed people to feel they were not simply passive victims of the political order or of global economic shifts, but could have some hands in making the future of their communities. The enthusiasm of many activist women to share their political experience in the dispute was really infectious. And their optimism that strike activism still had something to teach us about how the world could be better sounded a note of political hope at a moment when such hope seemed in short supply. It seemed in short supply when we did this project 5-6 years ago, and it seemed in even shorter supply now. But I think it also says something about why this narrative has become so dominant, because it's very seductive, and in a way also it does whatever its historical accuracy is, or its lack of historical accuracy is, it gives us something to hope in, something to believe in, something that we can work with politically. And it's doubtless, I think, this which makes their stories so attractive to so many of us, whether we're scholars, whether activists, people writing about the strike in the media. Anyone who's interested in politics or social justice likes this version of the strike, including myself, despite even when I have my scholarly head on. And I think this really explains why these memories of the strike, why that particular version, this heroic version of the strike, has become so culturally predominant today, even as other stories do exist.
Thank you.